Howdy! Welcome to Moonlight Less Than Moonlight. I'm Justin, and today we'll be talking about Anaïs Duplan's And Then She Said I Need to Tell You Something and Don't Hate Me For It, which was published in Boat's September-October 2017 issue. Anaïs Duplan, in his own words, is a trans-asterisk poet, curator, and artist. He is the author of a forthcoming book of essays, Black Space on the Poetics of an Afro-Future, Black Ocean 2020, a full-length poetry collection, Take This Stallion, Brooklyn Arts Press, 2016, and a chapbook, Mount Carmel and the Blood of Parnassus, Monster House Press, 2017. He has taught poetry at the University of Iowa, Columbia University, and will teach at Sarah Lawrence College and St. Joseph's College. Especially exciting this week is a recording of Duplan reading today's poem, which you can find in the description below, along with, as usual, links to his site, the text of the poem, and sources for whatever else comes up. Plus, the like and subscribe buttons if you feel so inclined. A quick content warning for race-based violence, and now, I'll see you after the poem. Welcome to After the Poem. Now, let's go back and take a look. As Duplan says in the video, the title is taken directly from the name of a song by Dean Blunt. Now, Blunt himself is an eccentric musician whose career dates back to as early as 2005 as half of the mysterious duo Hype Williams. Spin called him an art pop provocateur in 2015, which was followed up a year later with Blunt creating an art show that, quote, consisted of a bar serving beers and a single exhibit, which turned out to be a stock photo, accompanied by a piercing high-pitched tone a bit like the telltale tinnitus ringing you get after a night out, end quote. While Blunt's And Then She Said I Need to Tell You Something and Don't Hate Me For It is more melancholic, steady, grungy, the melody is cacophonic, sounding almost like a child in the middle of learning the harmonica. In an interview with Brooklyn Poets, Duplan says he wrote this poem thinking about leaping and argument. Right off the bat, this is visible in the structure. Tabs, varying lineage, two stanzas that begin with the same phrase and seem to work as a call and response. To begin with the first verb, though, pandering is a very specific word choice. While my first thought is of a politician saying whatever it takes to get elected,
I am not throwing away my shot.
The word itself traces back to more lascivious meanings. Pandarus was a Trojan soldier during the legendary Trojan War who, in his original Homeric conception, broke a truce between the two militaries by trying to kill the Spartan king Menelaus. Homer's Iliad would vanish after the 8th century BC, leaving behind traces that would inspire two Latin works, the 3rd or 4th century Ephemeris Belli Troiae by Dictis Cretensis, and the 5th century Deditis Phrygiae de Exicido Troiae Historia, both claiming to be Trojan eyewitness accounts of the war. These would lead to Benoît de Saint-Maur's Roman du Toit in the mid-12th century, whose invention of Troilus and Cressida would equally inspire Giovanni Boccaccio's early 14th century re-retelling in Il Filostrato. This was around the same time that Boccaccio and his friend, the also famous Italian poet Petrarch, would rediscover Homer and have him translated. By then it didn't matter, though, since the descendants of Roman du Toit were entirely unlike the source material. The father of English literature, Geoffrey Chaucer, would take Il Filostrato and finish writing Troilus and Cresside from it in the 1380s. 700-year-old spoiler warning. The story would expand on Boccaccio's Pandare, now a prominent figure and go-between for the titular Troilus and Cresside, star-crossed lovers who turn out to not be fate-bound when Troilus witnesses Cressida falling in love with the Greek soldier Diomed. Shakespeare, that other father of English literature, would retell Troilus and Cresside as Troilus and Cressida, except Pandarus, as he would now be called, would be bawdier and more tied to pimping. His final monologue even includes a shout-out to sex workers. Quote, good traders in the flesh, as he calls them. It's from this character, half a dozen Trojan War fanfictions deep, that we get the word pander and its sexual connotations, which themselves likely inspired the metaphorical political use. Although Duplan himself said he was thinking about leaping an argument with his mother about refusing love in his Brooklyn Poets interview, I think it's interesting to think about pandering in this broader context because of how it influences the image of love outside heart's door. Instead of self-serving deception, as you might imagine when thinking of a politician, you see something like plying a trade to survive. Love becomes something like a state of struggling to live, fittingly compared to jungle music, a genre of reggae and rave-inspired dance music from the 90s. Jungle was known for its heavy use of sampling and intense drum patterns, particularly what is now known as the Amen break, a drum pattern you might already know, which first appeared on the Winstons' 1969 track Amen Brother. You can almost feel the intensity of Love's pandering in that beat. Arguably, the Amen break and its later more intense reduplications might remind you of a heart that's under a dramatic emotional influence. Think of the passionate Troilus upon first seeing Cressida, his lover and later object of hatred. This feeling of being trapped in a struggle to survive appropriately ties into the image of cops coming in the next line, as if literal jungle music had annoyed next-door neighbors. An image that is reinforced by the blithely considered "who can say what time?" Love, now connected to fraughtness and risk, itself enters into a predatory relationship with the speaker. The way you came hunting. It's hard not to connect the cops to this idea of love as a hunter, as if when the speaker says, "I knew exactly which lord would take me," the lord is lowercased because it only functions with the authority of a lord. More like a feudal lord than a deity. The speaker evokes and secularizes Christian imagery further by thinking about, quote, being a child, end quote, with the concomitant innocence childhood implies. Although the speaker doesn't commit to this innocence, instead they depict it as being nothing better, nothing worse, a limbo state of personhood. I'm reminded of the lines from William Sharp's 1901 poem, The Lonely Hunter, made famous by Carson McCullers. Here in the heart of summer, sweet is life to me still, but my heart is a lonely hunter that hunts on a lonely hill. Love's hunting becomes disparate in this light, a starvation-motivated pandering. The speaker, in their turn, is reduced to a helpless childlike state, thinking, quote, "I thought I could mind control the situation," end quote. The line breaks the thought in half, turning the idea of controlling another person, mind control, into one, thinking they could be bothered, could mind the situation, and two, take hold of it, control the situation. Instead of a person to be mind-controlled, however, the situation becomes a shark in the water. And an interesting note here is that while sharks are typically portrayed as ravenous carnivores who hunt humans, this is actually pretty rare because humans are not part of their diet. The National Ocean Service notes that shark attacks often happen simply because they're confused or curious. The image the NOS paints of our relationships to sharks even invites us to consider that the heart of the speaker is as helplessly exposed to love in exactly this way, with love acting the shark, coming to the speaker in a straightforwardly curious way. This kind of innocent mauling could easily invoke what the speaker expresses when they say, "I guess I just mean it confused me, the way you came hunting." As said at the beginning, the structure invites us to return to the first line. It's not clear whether this is meant as also last night, or future last night, or reimagine last night. What we do know is that instead of pandering outside my heart's door, as it did in the first stanza, love's now fallen out my body, forcibly ejected. Between these phrases there's a tension, a possible contradiction. Fallen out is passive, and forcibly ejected is active. Speaking of contradictions, Aishin Hutchinson speaks about how the innocence and the beauty of his country, Jamaica, is contradicted by its history, that being the over 200 years of sugarcane plantation-based slavery. To deal with this contradiction, though, he says that the idea of beauty needs to be expanded, that it can be, quote, such a rigorous, twisted thing, like looking at the bodies of certain dancers, how they can turn themselves in almost inhuman positions, end quote. Mind you, beauty doesn't need to be the point of a poem. We might look at "And Then She Said, I Need to Tell You Something, and Don't Hate Me For It" in the light of its source material, though. We might think of Dean Blunt's song as trying to convey this rigorous, twisted beauty. Funnily enough, jungle music and its brother drum and bass are said to have their roots in Jamaica, specifically West Kingston, a region slangily known as the jungle. The speaker's seeming causal explanation for this inhuman position they're put into with the now fallen out, ejected love is that they tried to speak something about my mother, followed by the equally vague, it was like being something that doesn't have any limbs. We get a very suggestive simile. The speaker is at a point of pre-speech where everything is reduced to somethings. This point is like being limbless and caught in the gravitational pull of the mother-child dynamic. What comes to mind for me is the image of a fetus. I don't want to go too far with that image, but I think it's an interesting one to think about besides the idea of love pandering outside my heart's door. In any case, the speaker consciously calls attention to their failure of specificity with an anxiously declared,
"Over and over I had to ask myself about the words I was using and if those words were, in fact, killing people."
The somethings come across as attempts to mind control the situation when considered as stand-ins for words that possibly were killing people. There's a very literal sense in which this could be the case. Michelle Alexander points out in The New Jim Crow how the word felon, for instance, is a word that kills the future of its victims. The word carries a stigma of dangerousness and incompetence, which leads to more than half of businesses being unwilling to hire ex-felons, as one report reflects, alongside only 2 states in which felons never lose their voting rights, thus denying them access to an electoral way of improving their socio-economic condition at large. Felonization inevitably leads to higher rates of intergenerational poverty. In the poem's case, the words might not be specific words in themselves so much as words said out of anger. We might note that these words I was using seem to be merely tried, seem to be like being something that doesn't have any limbs, as if inexpressible in their intensity. Their killing power seems to follow from love being forcibly ejected from the speaker, in contrast to the preceding stanza where, however conflicted and pandering love may have been, love was proximate and could be expressed with the clarity of metaphor. If we return to the image of the fetus for a moment, the fetus being the thought gestating the speaker when over and over I had to ask myself about the words I was using, this limbless something about my mother, wordless fetus comes to stand in opposition to words which are, in fact, killing people. Considered this way, the ending of Duplan's poem becomes far more affirmative than Shakespeare's ending, for example, of Troilus and Cressida, where Pandarus snarks, "Till then I'll sweat and seek about for eases, and at that time bequeath you my diseases." While love is not easy for Duplan's speaker, it ends with the speaker confronting themselves with the consequences of spreading their dis-ease. The heart is a lonely hunter, but it gives birth to familiar yet new ways of loving others, ones that sample from their predecessors, as if from mother to son. So that's some thoughts on Anaïs Duplan's And Then She Said, I Need to Tell You Something and Don't Hate Me For It, published in Boat's September-October 2017 issue. Had a favorite line? Think any of my interpretations were off? Suggestions for future poems? I'd love to hear from you, whatever's on your mind. And while you're down there, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and check out my sources if you're so inclined. Hope you have a great week, and until next time, thanks for dropping by.